Раз, раз, раз.
Я просто хотіла сказати, що ми зараз через 5 хвилин починаємо лекцію. Якщо можете, ну, просто тихіше тут, щоб там нічого не заважало, я так попереджаю. Угу. Ага, да. Угу. Тільки його ж. Я просто його попросила стояти зліва, щоб його краще було знімати. О, ні, стоп, зліва це з іншого боку. Сорі. Так, щоб він не закривав. So here is your mic and clicker, and there is the standing. So our people who are doing the broadcasting, they ask you to stand on that side so that yeah, on that side of the presentation, because here we have the camera, and so that you don't stand in front. Okay. Yeah, hello everyone. We are starting now the next public event of our public program. And as you probably heard already, that all the events of this year in the public program of Kharkiv School are connected to the rethinking of the new role of the architect in the society and in Ukraine in particular. And we have today a very special guest. And for me personally, it's a pleasure to have a chance to invite Professor Rainer Hehl to our school, because this is a person who influenced my thinking about architecture a lot since I did my master thesis and some studies at TU Bерлін with Professor Hehl. And as you probably heard already, that our guest today has a very diverse and interesting background, which is especially helpful when we are rethinking what architecture can do in the society. Reiner Gel has a big academic career, but also was working as an architect in international design studios. And he came in his research work from studying urban developments in emerging territories, dealing with informal urban development. And then last 5 years or so, he was deeply involved in typology studies and developing the master program architecture and typology at TU Bерлін. And it's very interesting for us to have this input because typology studies is an important part of our curriculum in Kharkiv school. So I'm very excited and curious about today's lecture. And I think us as teachers in Kharkiv school, the students and the general public, which we're pleased to have today in this audience, will have very great input. And probably Professor Rainer Hehl will tell more about this discipline and his approaches. So please welcome on stage.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for this kind introduction. And also thank you, Oleg, for the invitation and the whole team to show me around the faculty. I'm impressed, about the school, about, also the level of improvisation, and that you can really see, activity here. I'm impressed about the studies in the beginning of this performative puppet. So a lot of things are actually related to my own background, which is quite diverse. Anna, you already talked a little bit about it. Also interested in performance. Right now, I'm teaching a chair which ranges from construction. I'm teaching also bachelor studies at the moment, but then I'm directing an international program, a master program. It's called MRT on typology. And I think this was a particular occasion to talk about typology. So my lecture is quite focused on that, on the typology question. It's entitled Investigations in Future Typologies. And maybe it's gonna be a little bit also academic in a certain way, as I also want to explain different typological approaches and how to situate a future thinking of typology within this context. But first of all, I wanted to start with this image. I like to show, because this is where I'm coming from, at least coming from now, as I'm teaching in Berlin since 10 years. And this is showing the center of Berlin. On the right-hand side, you see the east part of Berlin with the tower. And on the west side, you see actually the western center around here. And the faculty of architecture is sitting right here at this spot. And there is a big axis between east and west. And in the middle, this big green area. It's the Tiergarten, the garden of animals, you could call it. And actually, this is an amazing kind of green. It's the middle of Berlin, and the middle of Berlin is green. It was completely destroyed during the Second World War. And now it is, you even couldn't notice, because it's still, again, a green lung for the city, an open park connecting east and west. And the university is here. This is an image from before the war. So I like to talk about locations in terms of their historical perspective. Here you would have, oh, sorry, I have to orientate. Here you would have the Bahnhof Zoo, the western center, and then this is the axis going to the Tiergarten. And right here is the architecture faculty. It was an important urban center in the west. This is a famous hotel, Hotel Knie, and this plaza was called Knie. Now it looks like that, because Berlin was destroyed. 70% of the fabric was destroyed, and particularly here, rebuilding happened, and it was enigmatic at this moment, because as you imagined, after the Second World War, suddenly modernist language, the modernist type suddenly was applied. There was even a competition between East and West, because the East Berlin started earlier of rebuilding in a kind of Stalinist modernist classical manner, and the West had to cope up. So they came up with this kind of arrangement of high-rise towers, and the architecture faculty is right situated here. I even collected a plan how that urban planning happened. Suddenly it was turned into a roundabout. Roundabout is also the name of a students' organization now that is, you know, engaged in political activities. And here you see again the faculty building now on that spot, consisting of a tower and a kind of annex. It's a combination of architects. One architect is called Hemkes, and the other architect is Scharoun. You might know Scharoun. It's a very important German modernist architect who did the Philharmonic building, and it is an architect from the Expressionist modernist school of architecture. So this is the architecture school, and they are just about to build the annex. I wanted to show that to demonstrate a little bit the kind of history of that. It's an amazing building. It was conceived in the 60s as the first prefab building, prefab construction on site. So they did the molding on site. It was super progressive for that time. Here you see an interior building. Particularly the staircases are amazing. So each of these building components, they were designed particularly, you know, it's not market architecture, probably a building that you couldn't do anymore nowadays in this type of innovation. But it also became, it was erected in 66, but it then became quickly a location for protest, students' protests of 68, protesting against the change of the constitutional laws in Germany. And this tradition of a very vivid kind of culture of discussion and protest is still there, and it's not part of my lecture, but there is a special concentration at the school dealing with the civic society. So there are a lot of courses where you would then be in dialogue with the people of the city, and also doing some participatory design exercises. So this is just to give you a kind of overview where I'm teaching, in what kind of context. And I also recommend, once you're in Berlin, you really should visit the building and the school. This is how it looks like within the studios. We have very generous spaces to work, studio spaces, but in terms of numbers, I just explained, we have each year 250 new bachelor students and 180 new master students. So you can imagine that it's another scale of teaching, also challenging, you know. Actually, it's a privilege to teach, to learn in a school with classes of 10 to 15 people, I think. Now, I'm in charge of a special program. It's the International Master Program, MRT, which was introduced 7 years ago. The background of that is that the German government, particularly in Berlin, they wanted to have more internationalization in the university. And therefore, an international project was created, which means that the studies are in English. So it's open for all students with English language background. And in order to distinguish the program from other international master studies, we decided to have a special focus on typology. Why typology? Actually, the idea was that typology is understood as a model of change with a special potential for current challenges. Densification of cities, but also the development of open use hybrid building types. So there is a lot of change in how we perceive types, you know, like traditionally you look at a hospital or a school or I don't know, a town hall, and nowadays we realize we have school programs within hospitals, or, you know, we have to change the way we think about typology. And this was kind of an initial statement of the program, which is aimed at linking the change in society that we are witnessing now, the transformation that we are witnessing now, with the question of architectural typology. So why typology? I started to explain, but there is another reason why it was decided to have a focus on typology. There was a famous teacher here in a very fancy image, Oswald Matthias Ungers, who was probably influential for a whole generation, I would say. Also very diverse architects such as Rem Koolhaas was a very important pupil, or Kleihuis was a pupil of Ungers. So it was an enigmatic person who actually had a very special idea of typological teaching. For him, typology was something to go to the basics of architecture. What is the basics of architecture? Well, he said it's starting with a line, it's starting with a line element, and then it's becoming a surface, and from the surface is becoming a volume, and so on. And he categorized, as you can see here in a slide, that's one of his slides, he categorized architecture across the history in terms of if they are built of linear elements, if they're built up on like surfaces, plates, or if it's more like a kind of volumetric kind of thing. So for him, typology is an essential topic of architecture, of core architecture. Ungers was only interested in architecture, structure. As you could say, his approach was structuralist, a structuralist approach to typology. He was not so much interested in program. You know, for him, program was not important. So he would suddenly, in his lectures, you know, look at buildings that are centralized buildings across the times. So you would even have, you know, a piece of the Parthenon temple. You would have a piece of the Parthenon, you know, in Rome, compared to Mies van der Rohe's National Gallery or the Guggenheim Museum. So he was interested in the structure of architecture. What is the spatial structure? What are the structural elements, the columns, and how these elements are assembled together to create space, to create architecture. So from there, he was comparing very much like floor plans that are coming from different periods, and he was convinced that this, you know, is the, you know, about the cultivation of the architecture vocabulary, you know, in a structural way. Now, in order to think about typology today, I took a book from a colleague teaching at the Architecture University in Graz. His name is Andreas Lechner, and he came up with a book on typology. It's called a Design of a Architectural Teaching of Typology. And here in this book, he comes up with categories, because we know that typology usually is defined in categories, in functional categories: the theater, the museum, the library, the state, the office, leisure, religion, shopping, the factory, education, control. So there are some weird moments, because is control a category for typology? Because it's clear when we talk about museums like Ungers did, or it's clear if we talk about theater. And I scanned some pages in order to you know, reflect upon what are types. Looking at theaters, we can start with an antique theater. It's the Epidaurus theater by Polydeuces the Younger, 3rd century before Christ. Amazing how this early theater is inscribed in the landscape. So it's a landscape form of theater, and you know, that kind of the audience is inscribed in this round shape, half circular round shape. So next, here we see actually an architecture by Sharon I already mentioned. It's the Philharmonic building in Berlin, quite a remarkable, amazing building, because what is special about this theater, which is used for concerts, is that suddenly the audience is not only sitting frontal, but it's sitting around the center stage. And this changed completely how you would organize the architecture. So within the category of the museum, you suddenly have a different kind of configuration. And it was developed from the inside out. So that's why from the outside, it doesn't really look like a theater or a concert hall. I don't know, it looks like a tent. And they say it has an amazing acoustics because it's developed from the inside out. Then another project, I was actually part in the design team still. It's the Wiley Theater, designed by OMA. It's in Dallas, Texas. What is this about, this theater? And you see here a programmatic diagram from the typical constellation of a theater. Usually it has a front of house, foyer. Then it has the chamber, which includes the audience and the stage, and then the back of house, which is about all the technical stuff, the changing rooms, and so on. And what they did, they made it very compact. They put it on top of each other, these programmatic blocks, in order to come up with this proposal. Why? Because by concentrating everything on top, suddenly you can free the stage. So the stage is opening suddenly to the public space around it. So it was a kind of experimental setup. I just wanted to show these examples in order to kind of introduce a kind of classical way of typological thinking and how we can change the constellation according to new ideas. In the book, there is another example. It's designed by Aldo Rossi, a post-modern architect, and it's referring to the Berlin block. The Berlin block, like in many European cities, is, the perimeter block that is, creating the streetscape, as you know, and then you have the courtyards. Now he is saying that is the typical type of architecture that defines Berlin. And, building up on that, he's redesigning the Berlin block. Actually, this is designed by one architect, even though it looks like, designed by several ones. And it's a typical example of how postmodernism took a kind of typological language and then reinterpreted in a certain way, maybe changing it a little bit, making it more abstract or using colors, So for them, for the postmodernist architecture type was more like something that refers to the representation and the symbolic dimension of it. But now in the book, in the category control, I found another interesting type. Actually, it's the Berlin Wall. You could say, what? The Berlin Wall is it architecture? Well, it is definitely infrastructure. And first of all, we need to open our eyes and include in the typological catalog also this kind of objects. And it is architectural. It is obviously is a political space, and it's not only a wall. If you look at the Berlin Wall dividing east and west, but it's a zone. It's a space, with a void. And I remembered as I was working in Rem Koolhaas's office, and I remember that when Rem Koolhaas was studying at the Architectural Association, they had an exercise on like preservation classes, and they had to choose a historical building that they analyze. And Rem Koolhaas was choosing the Berlin Wall as a historical building to be analyzed, and being really fascinated how this very long building, is really creating space. It's obviously subdividing the space into sections, And what he was particularly fascinated that it was also actually loaded, emotionally loaded, you know, like a space of memory, a space of events, a space of performance of, you know, it was, he said that this architecture was filled, is a filled void, a filled programmatic void. And I like to show that because it extends also our notion what a type is. A type is more than just a functional category of, you know, how does a museum look like, how does a theater look like, but rather a type is something when we look in a reality that has a performance. Now, before this lecture, we talked a lot about performance, and even when I was shown this performative studies in the beginning of the course. So let's keep in mind that performance might be important beyond functional use, but I still wanted to show a little bit of a historical development of typology. And one thing that is clear is that typological thinking emerged basically, I would say, with the emergence of sciences. Because when the sciences emerged, suddenly it was about looking behind the things, how they are. So when these natural scientists suddenly started to study the human body, they made these sections, the cross sections, you know, to see what is inside. I mean, that's what you do also, right? When you do an architectural section, you cut the buildings. It's actually very brutal to cut buildings. At that time, it was brutal, right? Because in the Middle Age, the body was sacred. You couldn't touch it, no? And then suddenly they started to dissect, to see what is inside. But also these natural scientists, they started to be very analytical. So they collected the plants and they were trying to draw the plants in a singular style. So people like the botanist like Carl von Linné, he really developed a drawing style in order to, you know, place these plants besides each other and to see what is the difference and what is the analogy. And this is what they did with plants, animals. We could say they were coming up with what is called a taxonomy. Maybe you heard this word. A taxonomy is a system where you place objects in order to find out a logic. So that's the principle of science, right? That it's you're not trusting the appearance of things, but you come up with knowledge systems that look behind what things are if you compare them with other things. Like here in these amazing drawings showing pollen, you know, like from the plants. I mean, actually amazing architectural drawings that these natural scientists did. So one super important person for the typological thinking in architecture was Durand. Durand was more like a kind of anonymous architect, but he was an important teacher, teaching the bachelor course, actually bachelor, wasn't called bachelor, but the second year course at the École Polytechnique in Paris, where he developed two books. One is called Recueil et Parallèle, des édifices de tout genre, anciens et modernes. He didn't use the term type, he used the term genre. You know it from music genre, you know. And what he did first, he asked his students to come up with drawings, and like very precise drawings from buildings of the same category. Even sometimes they simplified the drawings in order to make them more explicit. So here you see the sheet of, you know, how domes look like. So like things from the same category, you would first of all translate them in comprehensive drawings. So what does that mean? It means that for typology, we need visualization, you know, in order to compare. So how do we visualize things is the first step in order to think about knowledge production. And from there, in his second book, which is called Précis des leçons d'architecture, it's more like a construction manual almost. that would then instruct these young architects at the time to build maybe more efficient, you know, because the big cities were coming up around 1800 and they had to build fast, and it was more like a kind of prescriptive method, like a building manual, where they, you know, you teach the people how to build. And of course, the school is deciding how, you know, so it was an instructive knowledge. This is how you build, you know. So it was actually the authority, typology as an authority, you know, how you should build. Now, this comes to the question really how we deal with knowledge production, and also related to the media. I just said that Durand did these two books which were quite influential, I would say, until now, how we understand typology in architecture according to functional categories, to uses, right? And this was then in modernism also very important, that you categorize building to functions, to uses. But you could categorize differently. You could categorize like Ungers in terms of structural reason. And I don't know, you can come up with any kind of, you know, aspect to categorize things, you know, and I mentioned, why not categorizing things according to performance? Now, this is knowledge production is related to the media. This is an early example. You know, Vitruve was publishing the first architecture book that is known in architecture. How do we access knowledge today? Maybe probably here, right? On, you know, with Instagram. This is how the new generation is accessing knowledge. And I don't have a movie here, but usually I show how you scroll, how you pick images in a maybe associative way, you know, and you say, oh, let's take this. This is beautiful. Let's like use it for the project. I find it quite dangerous to use these references in a very superficial way, to say, ah, that's nice, and I just copy it, you know. It's a kind of copy-paste thing. But in the same time, we have to ask ourselves, how is knowledge produced in our times? And we know that the internet is now a kind of incredible source and book. This is just illustrating the Facebook map, all the world's interconnected friendships, you know. I mean, we are communicated information in the speed of light. So it's not about, you know, it's easy to access knowledge. Maybe it's easy to access the knowledge for a floor plan of a museum. You know, you go to the internet, you type in. So even in architecture teaching, I say as a teacher, you know, I don't teach, you know, how all these hospitals or museums look like, but what is more important in teaching nowadays is to know the background, you know, to have the comprehensive knowledge, to have the understanding, to situate it within, you know, the history, to situate it within actually the current paradigms that we're facing. I was quite influenced by this book. Is written by this philosopher Michel Foucault. In English, it's called The Order of Things. And what Foucault was doing in this book, he is looking at the history of sciences, and he shows how knowledge is changing over time. You know, the way we conceive knowledge is changing over time. I just explained that suddenly there is scientific knowledge, you know, that emerged. And he's also showing that there are times of disruption, you know. So knowledge production is for certain periods quite stable. You know, everybody believes in this kind of knowledge. And then there is an eruption, you know, between the Middle Age and the Renaissance. I explained that. But also there is an eruption of knowledge between the Renaissance and modernity, when suddenly industrial production came up, right? And it's completely reshuffling the way we are thinking. And most interesting, what is happening right now? We are probably facing, you know, the biggest eruption in time. it's related to digitalization also. And actually, probably we even don't know yet exactly what is that effect, how that is affecting us, you know. I mean, you're born in the middle of that, in the middle of digitalization. How do we use that for architectural production? And how does that again influence typological thinking is a big question. Now, in this master studies where I'm teaching the first introductory semester, we were each semester choosing different themes. So for example, there was one semester on typologies of labor, of work, how work situation change now, nowadays. And this semester, or the last semester, it was called Typologies of the Anthropocene. Now I'm curious, who knows this term Anthropocene? A few people. Actually, what is quite interesting, the term comes from geology, from geological sciences. And you know, when you, in geological sciences, they categorize in very long times. So, you know, they say like 10,000 years, it is in this kind of age. And the last age is the Holocene. And similar to the knowledge production, there is moments where it's suddenly changing. You know, there was the ice times, you know, and suddenly the dinosaurs died out and there was a completely shift in how the earth was looking like, you know, how the sediments were formed, how the climate looked like. And one of a very influential geologist, his name is Crutzen, in 2001, he showed how, like now, the geological constitution of the earth is completely changing. So what is changing right now is, you know, the climate is completely changing suddenly, you know, and even the earth, the composition of the earth, the soil is changing. So we are now in a kind of at the beginning of a new age, which he called the Anthropocene. But what is very special about this age is that this time, the transformation, the change is made by humans. So like it's the humans that were affecting climate change. So we are, let's say, the kind of the masterminds of this change. And this, it's a big paradigmatic shift. Actually, it might be an interesting message for architects because it means like we are constructing the world, right? Even not only in terms of building, but we are influencing also the climate, you know, the air. We're influencing, you know, the soil composition, the nature. We are building the nature. And with that, with the Anthropocenic thinking, there is a new kind of consciousness that you know. It's a new kind of consciousness that brings us together on a common ground. And this common ground is the planet Earth, right? This is an image from Berlin. It's the, or Germany, I don't know, somewhere in Germany. It's the Fridays for Future movement. And I think it's amazing, you know, that's the first time in history we are realizing we are influencing the Earth and we have to get together how to design that system together, how to design the Earth system. This is from a book that from my mentor, it's called, he is called Marc Angelil, professor I was doing the PhD with. He's even talking about environment making. So the making of an environment is not only a climatic cause, but it's also a kind of a political and an economic thing, you know, how we create our environment. And another moment that is interesting in this Anthropocene thinking is the notion of deep time. You know, usually architecture is built for 20, 30 years, like the lifespan of buildings is like between 20 and 50 years. So architects are just planning maybe just for one generation. But now when we are looking at the constitution of the Earth and that we have to be careful with the planet Earth, we have to think beyond generations, you know, how can the children of your children still live on this Earth? You know? So it's a shift in how to place architecture, not only in the lifespan of our generation. There is a shift in how to conceive the landscape. This is an image by a famous scientist, Alexander von Humboldt, and he was going to the mountains in the South America, and he was writing down the species that he was finding in the mountain. When you look at these mountains today, the species occur like 500 meters lower because the climate changed. So, you know, observing the Earth also shows us that, you know, we are witnessing a big transformation. These are Anthropocenic landscapes. It's an infrastructure project, a huge dam in the Amazon forest. But this is also an Anthropocenic nature, you know, it's a nature of waste. It's a dumping ground where we, you know, living on. Actually, they say the city of Rome is also like a dumping ground that the people live on. And there are the demographic shifts. Maybe the most significant shift that we are witnessing right now is the migration crisis, and particularly also the climate refugees. They say in 2050, the number of climate refugees will rise to 143 million people. Now, that's the big picture of the Anthropocene. And at the same time, we are dealing with new technologies, identifying the change. This is a scan that shows the melting of the polar caps. You know, it's a kind of very abstract image of the Anthropocene. Now, that's, I don't know, just introducing into this age that we are now, you know. What are we gonna do with that? In the MRT course, we started with a very interesting exercise. We called it Zero Exercise, where we actually ask students to come up with a project from their own cultural background and to model it in foam. So we had an Indian student doing this. This is a well, you know, where you have water. These amazing step wells in India. It's an infrastructure, but a very beautiful kind of infrastructure. We had some Indonesian student, he modeled a fisher boat, you know, an indigenous architecture, vernacular architecture. This was another two indigenous forms. Interesting enough, asking for the Anthropocene, the people came up with vernacular architecture. You know what vernacular architecture is? Architecture that is based on culture. That's a project from Georgia, a beehive, but also high-rise towers, where they say this is the Anthropocene. That's the setup of the MRT studio. I explained before, we always have this table to create a dialogue between students, because it's about a horizontal communication that we want to establish. So the table is always the place of a presentation where we also invite the guests to talk about these topics in an open way. The international program is really international. We have students from Iran, Turkey, Europe, United States, Asia. So it's very fascinating to also think about the global dimension. And just one detail, if we're more people, we always project what is on the table on a screen. So we use the technology to kind of enhance these table presentations. This is a lecture format. And what we collected, I won't go now too much into details. We collected first our understanding of the ground, because we said that what really should look at differently in typology is an understanding of the ground. You know, what is the ground? Where is the architecture anchored? And the ground is not just only the background of architecture. The background, the soil, is moving to the center stage. Here you see a project in Spain where they try to cope with the dryness, flooding in Bangladesh, and also resource extraction from the ground. Then air was a very important topic to understand, you know, the composition of air, to understand what the impact of climate change is, but also the science of meteorology. I mean, and without air, there is no architecture. You know, air is in the space; it's not visible very often. but we have to deal with it. And I saw also amazing movies where you in the school doing experiments with wind and particles. So I thought that was also very amazing to investigate air. And then one category we found very important for the new age, which is kinship. And we understand kinship not just in terms of collectivity. In education, architecture education, the last 10 years was a lot about collectivity. What is kinship? Kinship is not only relating to humans or between humans, but kinship is relating also to animals, relating to the plants. So another understanding of how we connect to each other, and at the same time, you know, like from the early understanding of the paradise where we're still in harmony, we are now in the middle of a kind of a digital version of kinship that we have to use. From there, we always work with references, and references for us is a way to understand previous examples in a deeper way. And in the context of Durand, I was talking about visualization. We decided for this course to work with axonometries. It's quite common in architecture to draw axonometries because you see the object of the architecture, you can see the construction to the inside, and you also see somehow the performance of these architectures. And on top of that, we said, let's do axonometries that are also showing the ground. So it's always, we always show architecture, from now on, we always show architecture with the ground. Here you see a vernacular architecture from Iceland. It's a wooden construction that is like by time overgrown with green nature. And then next to it, a kind of oil rig. It's an infrastructure project dealing with you know, resources in the underground. That's a reference for the air category. On one hand, maybe you know this project by Lacaton Vasal, where they add to an existing high-rise building this buffer zone. It's like a winter garden. So this is also for the reason of air, the winter garden. And on the other side, it's an agrotropic research center for urban food production that the students analyze. Here, an example for kinship. We analyzed a lot of examples of vernacular architecture, how collectivity is represented and translated spatially in architecture. This example is the very fascinating Tulu houses in China, earth constructions, clay constructions that are circular in order to hold the collectivity, and then the data center as something that is, you know, very abstract and technical infrastructure that is in a certain way also organizing kinship. We were working on timelines because I explained that with the Anthropocene thinking, we have to dig into the time, you know, into the past, but also in the future. And here, for example, taking the topic of ground, starting with 4000 before Christ, like villages that were built on top of the water, infrastructure projects combined with castles, and then suddenly modernism, the metabolist projects in Japan that are creating suddenly artificial ground, and now in contemporary conditions, the reuse of a water infrastructure for an educational building in Medellin is also a transformation of typology. And then artificial land in Dubai, artificial islands, and maybe you know also the artificial ground that the big architecture office created on top of a power plant in Copenhagen. So all that, you know, a lot of research we did. I think I jump through that, but it's in order to understand, you know, what are the forces behind, what are the problematics, what are the phenomena. The Anthropocene phenomena of deforestation, you know, the dismantling of the Amazon affects all of us, you know, and how can we deal with that? And we were looking at the phenomenon, and at the same time we did case studies. How does that then work spatially in a specific location. Desert ecosystems, there is desertification happening. You know, there are more and more countries becoming dry. And we were studying that in the case of Swakopmund. It's a city in Namibia. All of these examples were investigated by the students, and they came up with the examples. And in most of the cases, they were also related to it, or they were coming from these regions. Dumping ground, the largest dumping ground for electronic waste is in Ghana, Aglobloshi. The phenomenon of air conditioning, that we artificially define the climate with air conditioners, which is causing a lot of energy consumption. You know, it's a huge, massive question how we deal with that in architecture, and how we can avoid these, you know, energy extensive machines. This was examined in the case of Cairo, where you can almost find no green area for cooling in the city, and how can that be resolved? Refugee crisis, students that were looking at the big picture, but also in the specific case of Lampedusa, where you know that it is holding refugees that try to cross the Mediterranean Ocean. Flooding is the topic when we suddenly realize that the temperature is rising, we cannot avoid. So the polar caps are melting, the sea level is rising. There are already cities that are affected by that, and in future it will be a massive thing, particularly for the people in Bangladesh. These students selected an area in Bangladesh called Kalabogi. It's a river delta, one of the biggest river deltas. They are already dealing with flooding issues, and if in the future they would not have any more connections to the land. But they were always also studying the local cultures, how the people already invented agriculture on top of the water, you know, aquaponic technologies, how they would organize the infrastructure with the boats in certain logistic ways, how they built bridges there, which were not only connecting islands to the land, but these bridges were important for cultural reasons. They did like festivals on these bridges, like ceremonies, religious, spiritual festivals. I'm just showing this in an exemplary way. We believe that we have to investigate more the anthropology of, you know, how people live, and to get deeper into that knowledge for specific cultures. Now, these students, based on that research on specific cultures, they were also looking how in Amsterdam they have already floating neighborhoods. And from there, they investigated technologies that would allow the design of a floating village that would be in the beginning connected with the land, but the more the sea is rising, the more it would become a kind of independent settlement. So this is a kind of foreseeing what will happen in the future. And then typology. In the first place, they looked at, you know, how floating platforms can be created, starting from how they are anchored in the ground, how you would build them, what are the materials, what are the specific connecting elements for these architecture elements. So now we are getting into the typology question. You know, what is the language of an architecture that is built on top of the water? Well, we have to start with infrastructure in the first place, and then in the second place, is a unit that combines aquaponic farming. Here in the middle, this is an aquaponic farming element with housing units. So this is a little kind of agri or aquaponic community that would sustain themselves with this aqua farming. And when we develop type elements, we always show where the ideas, where the references are coming from. So a type elements is always a kind of hybrid of a construction technology, here a vernacular type, where they were looking at vernacular Bangladeshi forms and how they are grouped around the center, infrastructure for energy production, but also the aqua farming. And with these elements, suddenly arrangements are created. I mean, what is fascinating in the case of a floating village is that you always can change the constellation. So the language of your architecture could constantly be assembled and reassembled over time. So that is the vocabulary. Also some special elements like the cyclone shelter school that they designed from various elements that they investigated, and also inspired by the bridge that I mentioned in the beginning, a kind of path connections that would serve as a bridge, but also for ceremonial activities. And the more and more from this vocabulary, which was even up to the point that they invented, street elements like streetcars, but also floating streetcars. For us, typology is not just building type, Typology comes to the question of what is a furniture type and how you can use it. What is the performance of this furniture element? That's why they even came to this scale, and then bringing all together in assembly that creates a living world, or a livelihood. After developing these various elements, we then take a step back and see, what did we do? What did we design? And we try to categorize. I mean, actually, this is an attempt to create a matrix, or a simple, kind of a taxonomy, where we say, oh, there are elements that are more prototypical, where you say this could be applied in Bangladesh, maybe also in Europe, because it's a kind of basic technology. It's more generic, it's more prototypical. And then there are elements that are very local, that are very specific to that cultural community and so on. And between the prototypical and the local, there are certain degrees. It's similar to language. We like to use the similarity between typology and language because, there is a very international language. I'm speaking like a kind of generic English. And even though it's not our mother tongue, not for you, not for me, but it's a generic way to understand each other, right? And we need that for a kind of global thinking. But at the same time, we have to take the local languages seriously, I believe, even the dialects, the slang, to really understand the formation of what a local identity is. And we are in the middle of the process of the formation of local identities, which maybe are based on cultures, maybe nations, but even nation states, I think they are a kind of container for a certain purpose, but we have to see how beyond the nation state localities, the specificity of locality is created. There is another kind of organization of that, mixing between or looking at infrastructure elements and more like elements that creating, housing on that level. And this is just a possibility how the language could be arranged. I like to show as example of the flooding because it's maybe the most like kind of flexible toolkit that you can imagine, because you can shift it around and imagine how typology within this language is changing over time. Maybe new vocabulary will be added to this language, So it's not like Durand, something that you prescribe and you have to build like this, but it's something that opens the possibility of combinations and, different elements, how they come together in various arrangements. Opening the space for possibilities, I would say, is a very important task for typology. And even here, the kind of imagination that the type element that they designed is suddenly overgrown by a layer of nature, becoming a wilderness or becoming a kind of independent growth process where the language is suddenly, adapted by something else. Now, when I look at the time, it's always already 1 hour, but maybe quickly through some other examples. Quickly, because one group of students, they looked at illegal mining there is a lot of mining activity in the world where it's not by big companies, but illegally by people, like this mica mining in India. Mica is everywhere. Mica is in your cell phones. Mica is in your makeup, you know. Mica is something that is produced here and then globally distributed. It's crazy. I didn't know that also. They looked at how these people work, and it's very precarious how they work. They live in slums, and then it's very dangerous what they do. So the students said, what should happen is they should stop this activity of mica mining because it's not healthy. And how could you now transform the mica mining into something else? And in terms of typology, what is very interesting, the first thing that they study is the formation of earth types. So they were drawing the way how the people excavated. So there is the hillside void, the cave void, the pit void, the depression. So different kinds of landscape formations that are stemming from this mining activity. And from there, they added, you know, integrated here housing, different types of housing, pit housing. Then here they integrated the community center, and here even a kind of aquaponic element. Again, you know, another example how now type components are the result of, you know, many different references that the students investigate, then assemble into a new kind of language element, and categorizing between housing, community center, recreational path, production zone. We are right now about making a publication. So as I don't have time to show all examples so soon, I hopefully will send you an example of the publication, and we are doing it as a digital publication, also open for everybody. So I can send the PDF. Maybe one more project which is actually dealing with something that is demographic change. Students from Japan, they were identifying, you know, that the countryside is dying out, you know, something that is affecting a lot of countries, including Germany, that, you know, actually the population is degrowing, you know that, and suddenly they don't know anymore how to deal with these landscapes. And in Japan, they are highly accessible by transportation, but there are only old people living there, you know, old aging communities. And what the students did in the first place is really investigating thoroughly the relationship between village structures and how they are embedded in the nature, you know, also as a cultural phenomenon. This is just to give you a little glimpse on that. This is a different types of landscape formations in Japan, different types. And that is a basic principle how the Japanese village works. The village is here in a diagram. It's like placed between the agricultural land and the mountain. And then there is two axes. One is the organizational street axis for the village, and the other axis is the connection between agricultural land and the shrine, which is the spiritual center. And what is quite amazing is they say, you know, the center of the city is the shrine. The center is actually outside. It's an interesting notion that the center of your village is the spiritual center, like the church, you know, here, or the synagogue or something. And the spiritual center is based in the nature. It's coming from this understanding of natural religion, you know, that, you know, the center of us is located in the nature. For me, it's an anthropocenic idea. But there are many other aspects, you know, the cultivated Japanese gardens, amazingly cultivated, but also inscribed in the landscape. Even though this is a garden that has a limit or a fence, it looks like as if it's blending into the nature. And then they have also these gardens, you might know the Zen gardens, is stone gardens. Like the idea of a landscape is suddenly in a model, that is, also within walls. But when you contemplate in meditation, you suddenly see it as a big landscape, as a big space, So I just wanted to show you examples of investigations. And on the other hand, they were also looking at how in Japan robots are used in care industries. So they have already robots taking care of old people, robots taking care of agriculture, and also Japanese people who are already much more into virtual reality. And then asking, what is the mix between a traditional understanding of the Japanese village and the new technology? And maybe quickly flipping through, they were inventing architecture types always somehow related to the nature. These are forest huts that would allow people, it's a bit like the idea of a weekend house, that you come from the urban centers and you experience the forest. In Japan, they have even this notion of forest bathing. They go for the forest to have the kind of energy of the trees. Then they designed a community center. This is inspired by vernacular architecture, but also Japanese examples. It's a combination of ritualistic centers, but also with convenience stores. This is a reinterpretation of a shrine with virtual technology. It's a kind of fancy idea. The garden house, which is, it's playful also. You see, it's not, I want to show this example because it's the Anthropocene with all these crises is so heavy. But we also have to come up with a playful way to use type elements and typologies to think about what the future of the relationship between architecture and nature is. These are garden houses inscribed within these Japanese gardens. That is a housing compound using also a combination of technologies, solar technologies, but they also have beehives here. So they had this idea that technology and animals and humans living together is not a contradiction. And the common bath culture is very important in Japan. And they were investigating how the bath culture is also related to a special relationship to the element of the water. In Japan, they call it the onsen bath, which is also a ritualistic practice. Then a kind of a hybrid of a Zen garden and an digital archive. So they like to have to say the memory of this place where they also, maybe store the history of the villages. The Japanese village is combined with this more abstract version of the garden. And then they have a design of a community canteen, which is also related to a greenhouse, a production of food, even with also a component of robotic agriculture. Again, classification. This is kinship dealing with landscape. So how we can connect to the landscape. This is dealing with kinship and memory. How kinship relating to each other is also something where you create a memory. And maybe there are new ways in a digital culture how memory is constructed. You do it also with your social media. You construct digital memories. How can we connect that with architecture and then kinship and the elements for kinship and living? And that was then combined into a comprehensive plan on this site, applying the vocabulary that they were inventing for this site. They could maybe apply it for another site also. That's the prototypical aspect of it. And then they say it's for humans, technology, and landscape. So also this understanding, we are not only doing architecture for humans. We're doing architecture for other actors, for the landscape, for the nature, for other beings. I think this is also an important new consciousness. And at the end, I like to compare this map. You might know it's a map produced by Atelier Bauwau. made in Tokyo, where they show the vernacular contemporary architecture in a landscape. This is the Japanese landscape, shown more like it's more about infrastructure than about anything else, you know, if you go to Japan. So let's think more about infrastructure than about architecture, was the message. And now the students project that, like in a kind of similar representation, showing that, you know, it's more about the landscape and the ground and how we inhabit the architecture with the architecture and ground in order to create a livelihood, you know, in this very complex world. And with this, I'm gonna end now to have some time for discussion, hopefully. And our slogan this semester that I want to also put in the end is, every act of knowing is an act of care. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much. It was also for me a very inspiring lecture and an input to see how many ways of thinking about typology there can be, and also all the examples from the different cultures and local contexts made me think how we can apply it and learn more about the context and the general environment of where we are living now, and the big tasks that stays ahead of us, like and the reconstruction of Ukraine, and how do we think everything, every destruction which is going on, and what can be born out of it. Maybe we can open now the space for questions, comments, or maybe reflections about the lecture. And I have a right to ask the first question, because like we were talking a lot, you were showing how the classification or categorization could be opened and created as a language. And I'm wondering, because of, when I'm thinking about typology and also like very famous publications, like also Elements by Rem Koolhaas could be seen as a typological thinking. I'm also thinking that classification is always restrictive, and that's also which Foucault was talking about. How do you see, how do you keep this difference between creating the language, which is open, and not creating the classification, which is restrictive? Like, how do you get rid of this categorization, which was present in the typological thinking?
It's a very interesting question, because actually it's something that we still are reflecting a lot, particularly for the for the publication also. And I think typology always needs, you know, clear categorization in the beginning. So typology is about finding systems, finding a systematic approach. No? And in that sense, we always are trying to come up with ordering systems, with a matrix that is looking at how does it look like if we select the elements that are in public use, or, you know, how do we the elements that have to do with animals, or, you know, but like maybe finding categorization that are beyond the modernist of, you know, working, living and stuff, you know, and finding new categorizations. And in the end, I think it is a way of finding a system and also undoing the system. And to say it is only one possibility to find an ordering system. And I believe now in this very complex world we're living, you know, there are many different systems, belief systems, and it's not about deciding for the one or the other. So our ability for the future, I think, relies on the fact that we are able to combine systems that seem not to be compatible. And this is something that we are trying to explore in typology, you know, like a typology of, you know, looking only at infrastructure and being really very systematic about it, and then suddenly looking at how human kinship and how humans relate to each other, which is more like anthropological thinking, and how we suddenly can merge these two together, even though we cannot really combine. But that's also a task of interdisciplinary and or transdisciplinary thinking. And maybe just the last sentence, because I was talking about Japan. In Japan, there is Shintoism, which is the old natural religion, which only exists in Japan. And then there is also Buddhism. And the people don't have a problem to have two religions, you know, to combine two religions. In Germany, it wouldn't be possible. You know? But I think it's a very interesting thing to think about. You know, how can we hybridize different systems and different categories?
Thank you. Yeah, if you need also help with translation of your question, I could help you. Yeah.
Nice to meet you, and thank you for the lesson. But I have a question. In this topic, you were talking a lot about the preservation and analysis before you kind of change. And so far we have to rebuild Ukraine. And we need to consider some preservation, but still to go and create something new. Where is this border between preservation and changing and adding something new?
I mean, it's clear it's a very fluid border, you know, and there is a big gradient. And we just before this lecture, we were talking a little bit about how amazing it is to investigate Ukrainian type elements. I would be even curious to go to the Ukrainian vernacular, what that is, just in order to see how it is and how diverse it is. I mean, I'm just arriving the first day in Lviv, and I'm suddenly realizing how complex it is to understand Lviv in terms of influences. So I would be curious about, the deep history, the vernacular types, and then there is an amazing, typological vocabulary of modernism in Ukraine, which is different from the modernist vocabulary in Germany, or maybe in East Germany it's a bit more similar to Ukraine, but in West Germany is different. And even though modernism claimed to be an international generic style, but if you investigate modernism in Ukraine, you might find something that is, highly adapted. So how can we investigate that? But preservation for me, I'm not a preservationist, is not about just restoring it. It's not about just securing it or replicating it. Preservation means to take it seriously, to really investigate the knowledge about it, but then to see if it is a language. How can we continue this language? How can it be, become a modernist language, based on the elements? And I'm using this word language because language is always something information. I mean, the Ukrainian language is something information, and people are learning it. I'm trying to learn it, and but and the German language now has more and more new words, of course, more like English words combined in German. So language is not something that has to be preserved, I think. So language is something that is dynamic, that is adapted to the contemporary conditions. And it's similar with architecture, that preservation has to be taken serious, but not in a fixed way, but in order to kind of take it, but, knowing that this modernist building should be like that, but can we combine it with a new use? And then we might add a transformation or an addition to that, and we extend the vocabulary of the existing. And I think for me, that's an amazing practice to do for the next 10 years or 100 years, Oleg, you said.
Thank you. And other questions or comments? Yeah.
Thanks for interesting lecture. Also, the examples really fascinating. Considering that the typologies exploring can take place in different places in the world, is there any international base maybe so these explorations to be into one system, so that this knowledge can be used for, say, some types which can be convenient to implement, like
Yeah, it's
real
very
things.
interesting question. Also a question that we are now reflecting a lot in the context of the publication. How much can we use international language? And just elaborating a little bit, I mean, it's problematic that things look the same all over the world, right? You know, airports look the same. So the generic language of contemporary architecture is a problem. But at the same time, we can learn from other countries. And, you know, in terms of, I don't know, this example I showed that Bangladesh could learn from the Netherlands, even though when they learn from the Netherlands, maybe they have to translate it in more low tech. So there is definitely a learning process, but it is always about translation into the specific, no? And I think typology should always be related to translating things. But your question is very interesting because it is also about the question how to share the knowledge, you know? And for that, I mean, my vision would be to create an amazing typology database, you know, where, you know, people from all over the world would kind of put in there, you know, references and types and knowledge, and you could then, even with a search machine, say, you know, I wanna look for all, you know, water infrastructure elements, and then you could see, and some of them might be helpful for your own context, and others won't. You know, some examples, they have been developed in the same climatic conditions, and then you can translate it. But of course, we, you know, what we use for the Namibia desert, we were looking at actually fog harvesting cannot be applied, you know, for Ukraine or Germany. So that's always like navigating between what can we share and what is common for us in the language, and where do the differences start, right? But the greatest project would be to use the internet to share, to collect and to share the knowledge.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you. My question is actually a very, very short one. Would you agree to the sentence that basically for you typology means an analytical and didactic tool?
I would spontaneously say yes. And for me, as I said, it's not about prescribing anything. It shouldn't be a code like in the case of Durand that you say, this is now how we should build. We have enough regulations, particularly in Germany. But it is, for me, an amazing method for researching, to produce knowledge. Because when you produce knowledge, of course, you can just observe and experience with your body and your experience, you know, with your perception in a phenomenological way. But we need to make one step further. If we research, we have to, you know, didactically, we need an analytical eye. We need to compare. How can we compare? What can we compare? What is similar? What is different? That suddenly is really a kind of a didactical exercise and typological thinking that is really taking in the whole range of historic vocabulary into account, is a fantastic research tool, you know, and it should be taken very serious for architectural research. Then the question is, that's not your question, how that is then also applied for design, you know, as a tool for design.
Thank you so much for your amazing lecture. And what I could see in this, like a very a lot of your project, you're looking for somehow coherence through hybridization. and it looks like not like some kind of compromise. It's new way of make each function more livable, more, I don't know, which help each function help to each other. And my question is, what is like a most valuable methodology for using for such kind of new type of coherence or hybridization, and which could be bring benefits for quite a different social or special types?
Yeah. Also, very good question that we're right now in the middle of reflecting how to hybridize to make sense, no? Not just to hybridize to make things more complicated, but to make sense. And is difficult because now, first of all, it's about relational thinking that we have to train ourselves, no? What is, when we combine with this and this, what does it do? But then we add this ingredient. It's almost like cooking, no? That, you know, you have, it's not, you don't have a recipe, but you have a set of ingredients, and you have maybe certain combinations that work better, but at some point, if you bring in too much, suddenly it's not tasty anymore. I don't know. I'm just using a metaphor, and it's relational practice, relational thinking. And I mean, there is in scientific thinking, there is a lot about how to think more in relational terms, not in linear terms, right? Because modernism was more about the kind of linear thinking, rational thinking. And what we explore here, and we want to explore it more in the publication, is also how to be more associative, you know, like how to connect things that maybe in the first place we wouldn't connect, but let's see what it does when we do. And we want to train more associative thinking. Also, in, you know, what we did in the course was that we were taking the references and examples and then pinning it up on the wall, and then saying, we maybe this with this, and then with this, and then. So that is something that we experience in academia, but in academia it's a simulation. So the better answer for your question is to do this relational practice in real life. And relational practice is in real life. Well, what if we build it in this way and hybridize with this, and only the reality will show if it works or not, you know? So of course, that's not something that we can just do in the studies, because projects in the university are always a kind of simulation, unless you go into reality. But the end of my answer is, you know, how to connect things is also, you know, an exercise in going into reality and to see, let's create new combination, and maybe in a more experimental way, and to see if it works and what the outcome is. And I think Ukraine, even with all these challenges that you face, it would be an amazing experimental ground to do so, you know, in the future.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Yeah.
Thanks for very inspireful and very well visualized lecture. My question would be probably about roles and responsibilities. As a teacher as well, I'm thinking like what architectural duties in this new era are coming out. Like we are talking about whole Earth, about Anthropocene, as buildings are not at this case, at this moment, they are not so valuable, like in this whole system, because architects used to thinks very precisely about construction, about structures, as you mentioned in your presentation, like all is important is landscape around, as it this system is what is really important. And architects used to think in this paradigm of 20th century, maybe earlier. What is your opinion as you see in European education, as what you taught? Like, what is the most important messages you are wanting to address to future architects?
First of all, it's a super important question to be discussed constantly. Just as a kind of saying that in the beginning, the architecture profession is in a big change. It's changing its roles in a bad way, because like suddenly we're only service architects for the economy, you know. And now I see that also, that students that are graduating, they have a hard time to position themselves, you know. And I think first of all, these questions should be answered by the young generation. But if I answer the question, and they should become active, that's what I want to say. The young generation should be active to define their own roles, you know, because it needs personal engagements, and that's what we are trying to teach. Also, and there is a big move in teaching now that students have more to say. I'm saying that now in this context. And you know, even up to the point where students also define more the topics and so on. So that's one thing that is important for this question. But from my perspective as a teacher, that was your question, the answer that I would give, the quick answer would be, the duty for the architects in the future is to connect. To connect also definitely with other disciplines. And I know it's difficult, but you know, we cannot do architecture anymore without having an ecological consciousness. We cannot. So how and we cannot study ecology. You know, it's impossible, because studying architecture is already quite complex and a lot. So we have to connect with people who have this knowledge. You know, we have to connect with people who have knowledge about sociology. How do we connect? You know, that should be also trained in teaching, and I know it's difficult, you know, because it's communication is, you know, takes a lot of time. And how do we find a language that, you know, can be used with other people? It also means, how do we communicate what is important for us as architects, and how do we, you know, communicate that to other people? So how do we connect? And that's the task, to be more, let's say, in the reality, you know. And that's, I find it super important, because architecture is losing importance. No, I just said it's more like a service profession. You know, I want to have this facade, can you do it right now? And we have to, I think we have to go into a more active role of, you know, designing environments. You know, we have the knowledge, we have the comprehensive knowledge of aesthetics, space. You know, aesthetics and space is architecture knowledge. Other disciplines do not have that. How can we integrate our knowledge, the core knowledge of architecture, which is about space and aesthetics and functioning, and, you know, building up a kind of environment with other disciplines? How can we connect more intensively?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Reiner, for the lecture, and thank every one of you for this great discussion afterwards. I hope you will follow us for our next events and think more about what kinds of typological thinking you can bring with you in your, if you're doing architectural education, or how from your disciplines you can connect with architects to build our future together. So thanks a lot, and have a nice evening.
thanks for having me, and I hope we will see each other again, and there will be a
Yes.
follow-up.
Sure.